If you are in Philadelphia and if you are in 30th Street Station, you can take a short walk through the station to an attached parking garage to oversee Amtrak's rail yard. In that rail yard, you will see the future of high-speed rail in the United States. Except there's one big problem. These train sets were supposed to be in service by now, whizzing up and down the Northeast between Washington, D.C. and Boston. Yet all of them are sitting here gathering dust. What happened and who's to blame for this? Well, let's talk about that, shall we? So, about a week and a half ago, an article came out under the Wall Street Journal highlighting the problems with the Acela and basically making all of the issues public. I think there's a lot of issues with this article in general, but we'll talk about that later. You see, if you're a massive train nerd like me, or some of my friends, we've been tracking these train sets and trying to figure out when they would go in service, and a while ago we noticed that they stopped running them, so we knew that there was definitely something up or something's wrong. But to truly understand all of the problems with the Acela, we have to go back in time and look at the history of high-speed rail in the United States. That's right, the Germans are invading. Or at least back in the early 90s, there was the US's first foray into high-speed rail. And before you, this doesn't count, but that requires a whole nother video on its own. Anyway, the first time the US seriously got invested into high-speed rail was inviting 2 European train sets over to visit the United States, both to run on the Northeast Corridor and to tour around the United States, showing off the technologies that were available at the time. Unfortunately, at the time, nothing really came from this because we had a neo-loser in office that didn't really want to spend money on anything for the public good. Because of the politics, there was no new lines or new services that were started in the 90s. But one thing was for certain, Amtrak really wanted to buy a high-speed train set for the Northeast, and it kind of made sense to buy one of these train sets that visited, either the X2000 or the ICE. But to Amtrak, these train sets weren't perfect. They liked the tilting capabilities of the X2000, but they did not like the cost. They liked the dual power cars of the ICE, but they didn't like the lack of tilting abilities. So Amtrak wants something cheap, and they want something that doesn't exist. So what do? They asked 2 completely unrelated companies to work together to make a train for them. For the power cars, they ended up choosing the 3rd generation TGV, or basically what's the TGV duplex power cars. But instead of doing the same thing of also purchasing TGV cars to go along with the power cars, Amtrak was trying to save money, and they were also looking for tilting technology. So where did they go for this? Well, they looked to the north. Via, Canada's national passenger railroad, has had trains since the 1980s that have been able to tilt called LRCs. The LRCs were usually towed by a diesel engine, but Amtrak would take them and modify them to be able to be towed behind the TGV power cars. So Amtrak's new high-speed train was coming together, a Frankenstein train between 2 different manufacturers and 2 different types of rolling stock. Finally, in 2000, the Acelas went into service after many teething headaches with getting them running. Amtrak also did something incredibly funny by selling the trains off to an investment firm once they had acquired them so that they could lease them back for the next 20 years instead of owning them for a short infusion of cash. That right there should give you a little glimpse into how little money Amtrak had in the early 2000s under the Clinton and Bush administrations. Just like the new Acelas, the old Acelas also had a slew of issues, mainly from manufacturing defects. In 2005, there was microcracks formed in the brakes that caused the Acelas to be taken out of service for a decent amount of time. Besides being called the pig, it was known as the Pig because it was built heavier for crash safety reasons here in North America. This also caused the Acela power cars to commonly hunt at certain speeds. Even with some of the problems and not being the fastest accelerating train in the world, the Acela continued to serve for the next 20 years, but in 2015, Joe Biden came to the rescue. In 2016, Biden under Obama announced a new federal loan package for Amtrak that totaled $2.4 billion, and a large part of this went to the next order of the next generation of Acelas. And with the new order of trains, that means you need a contractor, and Amtrak went with Alstom again, which that's when the problem started. So now that we're going to talk about Alstom, let's talk about the Wall Street Journal article that I mentioned in the beginning of this video. In this article, it goes over some of the challenges and problems with getting the new Acelas into service, and it goes into depth using Alstom as its source. The main issues with the new models entering service seems to be Alstom's inability to build computer models that accurately represent what's happening with the train. So what are these computer models? What do they actually do? Well, let's talk about them real quickly.
So we have our train math algorithm machine that Alstom would be using. And it has a few things that it takes into account. First, you have your age of your train. Now that's like your mileage on your car. Your car is, or your train has gone 100,000 miles, or your train is about like 5 years old or something like that. You have to take into account how much the parts are worn down and how much you could possibly be affecting your performance. The next, of course, is the most obvious one, which is speed. That's the most obvious one. How fast are you going? Like, that's pretty crucial. The next one is, of course, your track conditions. So this would be your weather. So your weather, of course, are the rails wet? How cold is it out? Pretty obvious stuff. And the last one, of course, is the other crucial part to speed, which is the rails themselves. What kind of track condition? Are you running over a switch? Are you running over an interlocking? Pretty important stuff. All of this stuff goes into your train machine device, and at the end of the day, it will either be checked off or be failed if it is successful or not. The problem that Alstom is having is that the Northeast Corridor is a very, very, very complex place. There's a lot of old track, there's a lot of new track, there's a lot of weird interlockings, weird switches. It's very complicated and it's very hard to model. I'll give them that. But the problem is that other companies have modeled it, but they are having problems with modeling the rails.
Alstom really doesn't have an excuse of why their models aren't up to par, because there are many other rolling stock companies that Amtrak has worked with that run on the Northeast Corridor. Take these ACS 64s built by Siemens, for example. Alstom sells plenty of TGV equipment all around the world. Why was this such a lemon for Amtrak compared to other places? Well, it's because Amtrak was kind of the beta tester for a new model year. When Amtrak ordered the original Acela, Alstom already had most of the models done, and that's because the TGV duplex was out for almost a decade at that point. The problem this time around is that Amtrak was not buying a proven model, they were buying a brand new model from Alstom. Alstom, being a French company, has a history of developing high-speed train sets with the French National Railway SNCF. Alstom is used to working with SNCF to develop a high-speed train set, so it's unusual to have someone else to be working with first to develop the train set or train platform as it is. The Avelia platform is now eventually going to SNCF also, but Amtrak was kind of the beta tester in this. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with the Avelia model itself, it's just that Alstom has developed this first with someone that they're not used to, and they don't have the models ready and together for the government entities that need to judge this stuff. Though it's a pretty funny fix to put a wing on a pantograph to make it stop bouncing, But besides that, I'm really looking forward to the Avelias going into service, and I think that they'll probably serve Amtrak for 20 years plus, just like the last Acelas. Let's talk about what Amtrak and what the United States could possibly do to avoid something like this in the future, to avoid having major delays on a new rolling stock order. Part of the problem with ordering a new train set nowadays is that there seems to be a lack of rolling stock manufacturers. Now don't get me wrong, there are a bunch of good manufacturers out there. Siemens, Stadler, Kawasaki are all in the United States now producing stuff for the country. But we also used to have a lot of domestic manufacturers that just have disappeared in the last 40-50 years. Domestic manufacturers are important because usually they can adapt to the needs of the country that they're in faster than some other company can. Then on the other hand, oftentimes these companies will tailor themselves so much for a market that they'll make a vehicle that flops and then they can never recover. Countries with successful rolling stock industries will support their industries even if they do produce a lemon or two, because they know that it's more important important to keep their industry in the long run than it is to have it flop and die out. Unfortunately, the United States never really supported its own rolling stock industry the same way France has, for example, and it has lost two of its best companies, the Budd Company and the St. Louis Car Company. And unfortunately, the US is only down to one last domestic rolling stock company, and that's the Brookville Equipment Company in Pennsylvania. If I were the Department of Transportation, and I know that in the next coming decade or two, the United States will need a lot more rolling stock to catch up to the rest of the world with train service, I would honestly throw Brookville a ton of money. I'm not sponsored by a rolling stock company, obviously, but I do think it's smart to support your domestic industries. Anyway, I'm hoping that Alstom gets their models sorted out, and I'm hoping that the Avelias go into service, because Amtrak desperately needs them right now. And with a future where we need tons of new train services, the Acela is the gleaming bright spot that leads Amtrak into the future. And if your flagship service has some nice sparkly trains, that doesn't hurt either, so I hope that they get into service soon. Unfortunately, Amtrak's rolling stock issues go farther beyond the Acela to more of their equipment, but that would take a whole nother video to explain, but luckily that's coming up. I'm going to be talking about Amtrak's sleeper trains and some of their equipment issues that have been plaguing them. So if you want to stick around for that topic, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I want to thank my Patreons, of course, and if you want to see a director's commentary video on this video, I have it already available on Patreon.